just a quick introduction. Alex, a good friend of us, he has a very strong background, Royal Marine, so that's a good link. He speaks perfectly Russian, so he will tell you the possible model character of the Lusitania propaganda for what is wherever. There's everywhere propaganda in this world, so this is an important reference. And I'll give you the floor if you think that. Basically, perhaps I should say that not only a filmmaker, but a writer and an author. So if you need an important speaker for one of your conferences, this is your man. Thank you very much.
Depending on the subject. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you. Would you like me to... This finishes very shortly, and I know some of you haven't seen this little thing, so if I leave this running, if you wish me to, until it finishes in a few minutes, and I can speak over that, if you wish. Right. Now, it is the only known film of the Lusitania, and the ship departed from New York on its 101st crossing of the Atlantic, and somebody, obviously not knowing it was going to be sunk, took this film, and the man who commissioned this film to be made, he's on the ship. He's actually in the film. I don't know whether he died or whether he lived. I'm not too sure. So it gives you a good idea, really, of the ship, rather than just showing you a diagram or a photograph of a ship, because it makes it more human. Of these people, we don't know who died and who lived. So it brings it right home to us here now. Because 100 years ago today, a lot of those people left this world, and some of them lived on, but not one of them knew their destiny at that moment, of course. Now the thing is, there is a saying in the English language, and I'm sure it's a saying in everybody's language, that history is written by the winners. History is written by the winners. And because, unfortunately, but factually, most of human history involves war, the victors in war usually win the right, so to speak, to decide how that history is written and to impose their will on the future after a war has ceased to be fought. Now, in the last 100 years particularly, the history has been written by the English-speaking world, and before that, generally, if one thinks of the British Empire and so on, but particularly the last 100 years. And the problem is that carries a huge moral responsibility. How we interpret the past in the present in order to go forward into the future. And for the last 100 years, we have really maintained, I would say it's a strong phrase, an atmosphere and a policy of blame. We have blamed Germany for virtually everything that's gone wrong in the 20th century. And I'm going to be quite contentious in what I say. Now, please do feel free afterwards to ask questions or to say rubbish, whatever you wish. But we have blamed Germany consistently for nearly everything that's gone wrong in the 20th century, always maintaining that the English-speaking world and the West generally are the paragons of virtue, the people upholding freedom and honour and respect and the dignity of the human spirit. But the irony of it is that 200 years ago, this year, when the Battle of Waterloo was fought just down the road, the Allies, the British, the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians did not condemn and blame France, but included France in the overall policy to rebuild Europe, to embrace France and say, it's finished this war. This was against Napoleon. We know a lot of people supported Napoleon. We know they're still there in France, but we need to reconstruct Europe together. Now, considering this is 200 years ago, this was a very broad-minded policy. And it really prevented another world war for 100 years. Because I would say, and I think anybody would probably say, that the First World War was the Napoleonic Wars. It's a war of 23 years. And given the population of Europe at the time, it is more catastrophic in its loss of human life than the First World War, as we understand it, 1914-18, or the 1939-45 war. Now, let me just get this back. The thing is, there we go. I hope, forgive me, I'm technologically quite done. There we go, that's better. And yet, 100 years later, when the First World War breaks out, within 4 years, we have condemned Germany rather than saying the war is over, now we need to rebuild Europe. We have punished Germany relentlessly. And I want to give you two quotes very briefly. One from President Clemenceau. We must turn Germany into the garden of Europe. Germany must feed Europe. He said that to the British Prime Minister Lloyd George. Lloyd George didn't agree with him, but Lloyd George also was under a great deal of pressure to ensure that Germany paid reparations for the suffering in Europe. But Lloyd George rather prophetically said, and I quote again, when the final act of the Congress of Vienna was completed, I have a terrible suspicion we will be doing this all over again in 20 years from now. Versailles, thank you. And sure enough, he was right. And again, in 1945, with a split down the middle of Europe, we have still used the idea of blame to justify more or less everything that has happened. We either blame the Germans, or now we blame the Russians. Now, if we look at the situation in 1914, Europe is at war, and the story I want to tell you really is a story of blame, the consequences of which are still with us today. And it's quite befitting that we hold this lecture today because of what happened 100 years ago. Those people you saw in that little film were going to travel from New York to Liverpool in England on the world's most advanced passenger liner. The few basic and perhaps boring facts are that the liner was 790 feet long, which is approximately 270 metres, I think. It had 1,959 people on board, including the crew. And it was on its 101st crossing, as I told you. And these people naturally knew that they were sailing towards Europe, which was at war, but suspected nothing. Because what they did know was that though the ship was British, it had a lot of American passengers, a neutral country, and surely nobody dare sink a passenger liner, a merchant ship perhaps, but not a passenger liner. And so these people confidently boarded that ship thinking, well, we're going to go into the war zone, we'll land safely in Liverpool and go about our business. Now, when the Lusitania was built, laid down, the phrase is in English, the Admiralty, because of the preceding arms race between Britain and Germany, was very aware that they may need to commandeer ships in the event of war. So a lot of the passenger liners and civilian ships were partly designed to be quickly adapted for war by mounting of guns or having their holds specially adapted to carry, as we shall see, arms, anything that would improve a war effort if there was a war. And the ship was registered in a journal or a book that still exists today called Jane's Fighting Ships. Everybody in the maritime industry knows of this book. Every navy in the world refers to it. It registers the role that a ship essentially has. And the Lusitania was called potentially an armed light cruiser, meaning it could actually be used for war as a militarily aggressive ship. It had guns put on it in 1913 as an experiment to see if they could be mounted at the prow, and the guns were taken off. But the capability of mounting those guns was still on this passenger liner. But it didn't have the guns, of course, when it made this journey in 1915. Now, it was captained, I'm going to just take this on to we go back to that one, by this man here, William Thomas Turner. Now, William Thomas Turner was probably the most experienced mariner in the United Kingdom, not in the Navy, but in the merchant service. He was the senior captain in the Cunard fleet, and it was for him to actually become the captain on this fatal journey. He was a man greatly loved by his crew, but not very much in favour of entertaining passengers. Now, as you probably know if you've been on a cruise, the captain has a responsibility to entertain the passengers very often, and I presume they enjoy it, but one never really knows. But Captain Turner used to say, and I quote Captain Turner here, "I am a ship's captain, not a bloody music hall act." So he really didn't enjoy this. But of course, Cunard were forcing him to do this. But the problem is that the more antipathetic he was towards his role as a host, the more people wanted to get on the ship because they wanted to see if they could befriend him and say, well, I did manage to have dinner with Captain Turner. So it didn't work out the way he wanted. So this man is in charge of this ship, and he has a great responsibility. This man...
One sentence, he was also an officer of the Royal Navy.
Yes.
And the boat was running under a red flag.
Yes. But under a merchant flag. Yeah. But as opposed to the white ensign, which would have made it a deliberate target. Now this man, Kapitän Walter Schwieger, was U-boat captain, Unterseeboot 20th U-boat 20, in the German submarine fleet, and an ace. He was number 6 on the list of the 12 top captains, achieving what is known in the service as a great many kills, a great many sinkings of vessels. 30 years old, a crew of 35 on his boat. Now, what placed these two men's destiny together was that Walter Schwieger and his crew had been hunting merchant vessels, and the code of war at the time was that a U-boat captain would contact a merchant vessel, then inform the captain of the merchant vessel that we are going to sink you because we are at war, you've entered a military zone, you have time to lower your lifeboats and evacuate your crew. And this was a principle generally adhered to. But poor Walter Schwieger had had an unsuccessful trip. He had been out of German waters for some while, and he'd only managed to kill or sink 2 minor vessels on this particular foray, this particular journey. And he was ordered back home. He had 3 torpedoes left. And the German Navy always instructed a U-boat captain to keep 2 torpedoes because they had to get back safely into German waters, because generally the Royal Navy dominated the seas. And so they were for defence against probably other warships. But he had 1 left he could use. Now, we're going to see later how these 2 ships converge, their lines converge. But basically, what the world knows is, and what the world has been told for 100 years, and what the Belgian reproduction of the papers at the time have shown, and the language at home on the BBC this morning about this anniversary, is this man torpedoed a passenger liner and was responsible for the deaths of 1,206 people. And that's what history really knows, except for people like yourselves here and other people interested around the world who are not content with that story. So those are the facts. We could leave it at that, as has been done. Or we could ask, there's more to this story, this is rather suspicious. So let's look briefly at the timeline. You have 2 captains who are very, very good at their jobs. They're both known to be humane men, they're both known to follow orders, but also have the ability to take initiative, as we shall see later. And you have to imagine that the Lusitania is approaching the war zone. It can either go north-east over Ireland and down into Liverpool, if those of you familiar, if you have a mind of the picture of the British Isles in your head now, or it can go south-east up into Liverpool. Now at 11 o'clock on May the 7th, 1915, 11 o'clock in the morning, the usual escort that was given by the Royal Navy, this would be a warship, to accompany a merchant vessel, or certainly a passenger liner, back safely to port, was taken away. This was HMS Juno. It was a small, old cruiser. And the Admiralty decided that this escort was not necessary for the Lusitania, contacted the British naval authorities in Ireland and said, withdraw the escort back to base, which is what happened. Now, at 12:10, Lusitania, thinking that everything is fine, that there's obviously no U-boat in the area or U-boat activity in the area because they've not been warned of it, it goes northeast. It's going to go round the top of Ireland. At 20:20 in the afternoon, this man, Vice Admiral Charles Coke, who is in charge of the naval telegraphy station in a town called Queenstown in Southern Ireland, is not happy with the situation. He's been in Southern Ireland for some while. He knows very well what sort of U-boat activity has been undertaken in the vicinity for a very long time. And he knows there are U-boats, or a U-boat, at least one, in the area. He has tried to contact the Admiralty to say, look, I need permission to give the escort back to the Lusitania, because we don't know where this U-boat is, or he didn't know where it was, but we know it's in the area, we know it's been active. And he receives no response. No response at all, initially. So he sends a message to Captain Turner and says, look, there is U-boat activity in your area. I advise you to come to sail southeast and come into the lee, or come into the presence nearer the coast where you're less likely to be attacked, which is what the captain does, of course. He sends this message by code, and Captain Turner, who is familiar with the codes, obviously manages to translate this. But the problem is, of course, by now, Capitan Schwieger is aware that there's a very big prize on the horizon, that the Lusitania is in waters, and he has got the opportunity to track this vessel. Now, when the Lusitania changes course southeast, he is moving, Captain Turner is moving into a great deal of danger. And the courses of these two boats, or these two ships, are now converging. At exactly 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, Captain Schwieger releases the one torpedo he has, and due to a slight miscalculation in his arithmetic, or his geometry, so to speak, the torpedo strikes towards the front third of the ship, nearer the prow. And Captain Turner, in the inquiry afterwards, says the sound was like a heavy door being slammed shut. But very, very shortly after that, there is a second and incredibly powerful explosion, which Captain Schwieger, in his ship's log, says an unusually heavy detonation. And the U-boat receives the shock waves underneath the water, and the Lusitania is visibly rocked. This is a boat that is nearly 300 metres long, and it's been hit by one torpedo. Just to give you an idea, 2 years later, the sister ship of the Lusitania was hit by 12 torpedoes and still managed to limp home, still managed to get home. So the possibility of sinking this ship through one torpedo is virtually impossible. So, at 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, poor Captain Turner is aware that something is very seriously wrong, and the ship is beginning to list, it's beginning to turn. So he sends an SOS. And if any of you are familiar with SOSs, the idea is to make the message as short as possible, with as much information as possible, but without giving too much detail. SOS, SOS, SOS. Come at once. Big listing, 10 miles south. Old Kinsale ahead. That's all the Navy need to know. Now, Admiral Coke has already decided to take a great professional and personal risk. He's not happy with the lack of information, the lack of communication from the Admiralty. He has already sent out HMS Juno again to escort the Lusitania, but sadly the Lusitania has already been hit. So Coke doesn't know that until he receives the SOS. But unfortunately, at those few minutes between it arriving meant that Coke was unable to take the action he did. Then we come to the worst moment of all. After 18 minutes, the entire ship has sunk. 18 minutes. Even by modern standards of a smaller ship, that's a very, very short time for a sinking. It sinks in 18 minutes, so 2:30 in the afternoon, it's gone. 1,206 people are dead, have been killed. They either sink with the ship or they drown. Now, we could leave it at that, because this is now a fantastic, from the British point of view, an absolutely fantastic occasion. Marvellous. This is just what the British want. German U-boat sinks passenger liner of a neutral power, with citizens of a neutral power on board, unarmed, a totally unjustified attack. Now, we can see already what the Germans must be thinking when they get news of this, and also the British. There is on the surface no possible justification that the Germans can give for this action, and it presents a wonderful opportunity to say the Germans have completely disregarded all the rules of war hitherto, and this is the sort of enemy we're up against. But it's not as simple as that. So that's the story that the world gets. Nasty, evil Germans, ruthless U-boat captain, poor innocent British. So, let's go on to the next one and we'll see who we've got. Now, this is where it gets much more complicated. And I've picked a picture of Winston Churchill as a younger man because this is not the cigar-smoking, Homburg-wearing chap doing this that we know from the Second World War. This is a much younger man, of course. He is First Lord at the Admiralty. Next to him, Sir John Fisher, probably the greatest naval reformer in British history. A man from a very humble background, known to have a very short temper, but brilliantly intelligent and brilliantly efficient. And he was the man, almost from a military point of view, almost entirely responsible for being able to beat the Germans in the naval arms race in the 1890s and early 1900s with the Dreadnought building campaign. He also doesn't like Churchill. The two men have clashed. And the reason the two men have clashed, and it is relevant to this story, is Winston Churchill at the moment is very, very concerned with one of his plans, and that is the attack on the Turks at Gallipoli. His main consciousness is, can we get through Turkey, destroy the Turks, put them out of the war, and really make Germany vulnerable from the south and the southeast? And he's staked almost his reputation on this. Admiral Fisher said, this is untenable, it is unwinnable. The Navy cannot support this attack effectively. It is simply not possible tactically. You are getting into, well, excuse the pun, very deep water here, and he resigned over it eventually, very shortly after. And then we have this other man who actually died in 1965 at 100 years old, the same year that Churchill died, actually. Admiral Henry Oliver, probably no one's ever heard of him, that Admiral Henry Oliver was the naval secretary to Churchill, and he plays quite an important but quite invisible role. And the suggestion is on the title, Room 40. This is a room in the British Admiralty, in the old Admiralty building, not the modern one, which monitored every single communication between the British Admiralty and every British ship, and all of the key thing here, all of the German communications. And the reason for that is that 1 year before the war, the British had severed all the undersea cables that the Germans had laid because they were feeling that there may be a war soon. So they took preemptive action and destroyed or severed the undersea communications cables, which meant that the Germans they were forced to communicate by radio. Now you'd think that was fine, but of course every radio communication between German naval headquarters and their ships and U-boats is in code. But the British managed to capture 3 German code books and break the code. Almost like a precursor of the Enigma code from the Second World War. But one thing the British have always been fairly good at is applying minds to breaking codes. They broke Napoleon's code, which meant in the Peninsular Wars in the 1809 to 1814, the British knew exactly what Napoleon was doing at every moment, and they never found out the code was broken. So, back to this, or last century I should say. Now the interesting thing about this Room 40 is the men who operated the equipment were under the rules of war, if you like, which at the time meant that anything they disclosed would be an act of treason and they would be shot. These are serving sailors, ordinary ranks. So the only men who knew what was coming in or certainly going out of this room were Churchill, Fisher and Oliver. Then, although I mention this man again, Oliver, later, he kept quiet till his dying day, frequently asked, as time moves toward our era, is there anything more, what went on? And he never once said anything about it. So he took his secrets to the grave, as recently as 1965. So that really suggests that these 3 men, or at least certainly the 2 that had the real power, Churchill and Fisher, may have known something about the fate, and may have even planned the fate of the Lusitania. Now, when we look at this particular room, there's one thing that's come to light fairly recently, or the records from this room, I should say. U-boat 20 in the Public Records Office at Kew in London, or just outside London. The log can be read, it's in the public domain now. Has an entire logbook kept by the Navy for every single movement it made for several weeks beforehand. No other U-boat, and there are records from other U-boats, has a record that covers all of its movements. Captain Schwieger communicated with German Naval HQ every 4 hours for weeks. So fortunately for the British, they knew exactly where this boat was at all times. And being a successful U-boat captain and being one of the successful aces rising through the ranks, not all by any means, but a lot of his hunting ground, if you like, was in the waters of what's called Fastnet, if you listen to any of the shipping forecasts. A rather large area to the south and southwest of Ireland. So, from the point of view of the British, they know where this U-boat is all the time. From the point of view of Captain Turner, he knows nothing about it at all. And the absence of communication between Room 40 at the Admiralty and Vice Admiral Charles Coke down in Queenstown in Ireland, and this man, is very, very concerning. By this time, we're facing quite a new, remarkable thing from the British point of view. The propaganda is being planned and disseminated around the world. This is a major propaganda coup for the British. This is the sort of thing you're seeing in America. 2 torpedoes sink Lusitania. Well, you can read it. Many Americans among da-da-da. And you're seeing a massive new type of war emerging, which actually is very, very effective. And in fact, it's lasted to this day. The reason we're in this hall today is because it's only in recent years that we've begun to dispel some of the lies and illusion around this particular incident. Now, what about this particular sinking? Why did this ship get sunk with 1 torpedo? And the reason is, which has been denied for a long time, but now can be denied for no longer, is the second explosion was caused by something that legitimately, under the rules of war, make the Lusitania a target, a legitimate target. There still is a moral decision on behalf of the captain to be made, but nevertheless, from the point of view of its legitimacy under the rules of war, he is entitled to attack this ship because it is being used as a carrier for arms directly for the British war effort. And the British already have a major problem as early as May 1915, not even a year into the war. The German economy is producing twice as many shells, German industry, as the British, 3 times as many as the French, 4 times as many as the Russians. The Germans are more efficient, but we all know that's normally the case anyway. So the British have a problem. They don't have enough shells getting to the front. And the best way to get shells to the front is to get somebody else with a massive industrial capability to make them for you, even though officially that power is neutral. And the United States is, of course, neutral. Now, the Americans, being the good businessmen that they are, and also the public having no appetite whatsoever for a war against Germany, seeing this entirely as a European affair, are seeing this great business opportunity here. And the Admiralty, the British government through the Admiralty, has already appointed a man by the name of J.P. Morgan, who you may know from it's a name well known today for obvious reasons, as the official arms procurement agent for the Admiralty Trading Board, which is the part of the Admiralty that deals with overseas trade and procurement of weapons and equipment to make weapons. Now, when a ship leaves port, even to this day, it has to give over a bill of lading, a manifest, which tells you exactly what the cargo is. And of course, when Lusitania left, it did exactly that. The manifest was given over to the port of New York, logged. Fine. Then the ship can depart, and the ship duly did depart. 3 days after it set sail, another manifest appears, listing exactly what the contents were. Now, the reason why this rather sort of uninspiring photograph is on the screen is because for decades, a lot of the argument had been around the fact that nobody could prove that the Lusitania was containing arms, even if it could be suggested. Now, this particular document, the genuine manifest, had been hidden in the F.D. Roosevelt archives for a very long time, and it's fairly recently. And on page 2 of that document, I think it's about 24, 27 pages, it tells you exactly what was on the ship. Now, I'm going to read those out because it's quite striking, if I can find the bit of information. Right, here we go. 5,000 3-inch shrapnel shells. Now, these are big shells. That's 1,248 cases of shells, already primed, which means they're ready to go. All the British have got to do is get them over the channel onto the Western Front when they arrive. 3,303 bullets for the standard British Army rifle at the time. 18 cases of gun cotton, which is necessary for the gun cotton. Gun cotton is something necessary for the manufacture of shells and arms. So, of course, the Germans are fairly aware that this is going on. And the Americans are certainly aware, because each year Morgan is taking 1% of the cost that the British are paying to the Americans, making him an exceptionally wealthy man already. And he's doing about $300 million a year business in arms. By the time America enters the war, in April 1917, 2 years later, $2 billion, that's about $60 billion worth of arms, are being sold to the British. That's some going for a neutral power. Now, the problem is, of course, is that this really means nothing to the world at all. Because to the rest of the world, to the public in Belgium, France, America, Britain, Australia, the rest around the world, this is a war crime. And they're not even interested in whether the thing was carrying arms or not, because the psychological war has already been won. There's a lot of anti-German feeling in America, but not sufficient to get the American people to want to go to war. So it's not entirely successful for another 2 years. Let me come on to the next thing. There we go. So you've got these three individuals again. Now the question is, did they know what was going on? It's very easy to say, yes, there's definitely a conspiracy at work here. They did know what's going on. This was carefully engineered. But of course, for this to be engineered with any guarantee of success at all, let's deal with the first one first. Churchill. He has to know at every minute, not every hour, via Room 40, via naval intelligence, where U-boat 20 is, where Captain Schwieger is. He has to ensure also that somehow Captain Turner is going to guide his vessel into the path, or a path of convergence, to U-boat 20. Not even Churchill, with his extremely intelligent mind, is capable of doing this. And also, he's more concerned with the Gallipoli campaign, which from the first days is going desperately wrong. His reputation is staked upon that. Further, he's gone to France. He's not present around the time of the sinking. This doesn't preclude him from being involved or even engineering it, but it works well for Churchill. Admiral Fisher, on the other hand, is furious because he regards this as a failure in naval intelligence, because he knows full well that if there is a plot at work here, if this is deliberately engineered, then the Navy is going to come out of this, or the Admiralty is going to come out of this very, very badly indeed. This man probably knows what's going on, Oliver, but judging by his countenance, it gives you a pretty good idea, probably, unless he wasn't happy that day, that he's not likely to say anything. So, now, So the thing is with Winston, going back to Churchill again, who was really the most important individual in this case, if it isn't a plot, then of course it's a fantastic, as I've said before, coup for the British, propaganda-wise. It simply means that we have to find a scapegoat. We have to find a reason why this happened. And as I said, Fisher, of course, is not very happy that this is coming down, or the blame looks to be coming down upon the Admiralty. So what do? We need the scapegoat. And the scapegoat of these three men, I call these heroes, they're not technically heroes, of course, but these are the three men who are put under tremendous pressure politically from political circles. Turner, as we shall see in a minute, is the greatest victim of this. Coke is made a bit of a scapegoat, but fortunately, because he did take action contrary to his orders, they could hardly blame him. And this man, who we'll come to a little bit later, John Byam, Lord Mersey, who conducts the Board of Inquiry afterwards. Now, by the time Captain Turner is rescued, because he does survive, he did stay with the ship. He was prepared to go down, as captains did in those days, with his ship. But he was washed off the bridge when the ship sank and survived and picked up. He's not expecting to be treated in the way that his country treats him. And we'll see what happens in a minute. So, all the might and majesty of the British state now comes down on these two individuals. Quite clearly, Captain Schwieger is a serving officer of an enemy power, so that's quite easy to know what to do with that. And it means that this man, or Captain Turner, has to take the brunt of the attacks. And there's a few quotes here, and I'll read them out. I'll put them on the screen in a minute, but I'll read them out when this Board of Inquiry takes place. There's some of them, you can read them there. Churchill says, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. For our part, we want the traffic, meaning we need the arms. The more the better, and some of it gets into trouble, better still." Now that's a letter that has since come into the public domain, that he wrote to a man called Walter Runciman, who was the chairman of the Board of Trade, president of the Board of Trade, I should say. Then we have Lord Fisher, who's looking at this in a much more simplistic manner. Captain Turner of the Lusitania is a scoundrel and has been bribed, and the rest of the quote is, by the Germans, which of course is absurd. But then we have a man of tremendous importance in the history of the First World War, the events leading up to it, the British Foreign Secretary, who follows very closely the Board of Inquiry under Lord Mersey. Captain Turner was fully informed of the presence of hostile submarines in the vicinity of the place where he was torpedoed, and the inquiry was told the captain recklessly took the unarmed Lusitania into the danger area. Well, we'll see in a few minutes that he wasn't. So Edward Grey really is just doing what he knows his government has to do, find somebody to blame, but at the same time maximise the propaganda benefits of this. Now, the Admiralty, that man I showed you earlier, Oliver, wrote to Lord Mersey, and again the documentation is now in the public arena. "I am directed to inform you that it is politically expedient that Captain Turner be most prominently blamed for the disaster." So poor Turner is really the hero of the case, because it works. There is somebody on his side, and it happens to be, let's get back to it, this man on the right there. This man, John Byam, 1st Viscount Byam, Lord Mersey, has already sat on the Board of Inquiry and chaired it for the sinking of the Titanic. He's a specialist in maritime sinkings and boards of inquiry, and he knows exactly what is going on. But he has a sort of Pontius Pilate attitude. He's told, you must blame the captain. But he refuses to do that. This is an innocent man. And one of the quotes that I didn't put down on the screen is that this man's reputation is beyond repute. I will not, under any circumstances, have this man's character ruined for the expediency of this nation. However, where pressure was put upon him was to say, well, somebody has to be blamed. And it's going to have to be an almighty mess up in the Navy. But Fisher, of course, is saying you can't blame the Navy because it makes us look incompetent. And there are issues at stake here. So there have to be 2 torpedoes that struck the ship, which gives it a better chance of sinking. Not generally a valid one, but a better chance. The second explosion is put down to a second torpedo because a lot of the survivors say there was a second explosion. Very few of them say they saw a second torpedo. Of course they didn't. But a lot of them must have assumed that. And further things happen is that the British government at the inquest, or for the purposes of the inquest, request that corpses taken in for post-mortem show no signs whatsoever of any damage as a result of explosions due to firearms. Because these shells I mentioned earlier have hundreds of balls in, probably slightly smaller than a golf ball, so that when the shell explodes, it sprays these balls at hundreds of miles an hour over an area where men are advancing or fighting, or not fighting, advancing against your troops. And of course that means it's a terrible result, but these are weapons of war. And we were, all of us at that time, our nations, at war. So Lord Mersey is not willing to blame Turner, so he is exonerated, he is cleared. And this is all a terrible disaster, entirely to be blamed on the Germans. Now, the thing is, of course, is that although they've tried to blame Turner, these are the key issues. Let's go a little bit further on, then we come back to them, they come in a minute. Captain Turner was told nothing at all about the presence of U-boat 20. Only Admiral Coke took the initiative against his professional reputation and against possibly the chance of a court-martial to send back the escort, but sadly too late. There was no radio silence at any time through breaking of communication between the Admiralty and Queenstown Naval Station, which was run by Admiral Coke. There was no excuse for no communication. The Admiralty sent no orders, no warnings, no Q ships, no escorts, despite 4 warships being just a few hours steaming away: HMS Lucifer, HMS Leverrook, HMS Linnet, and HMS Legion, all of which, or at least one of which, could have been sent out to escort the Lusitania safely southwards through Southern Ireland up into Liverpool. None of them were sent out. The radio, and here's the most important thing of all, in my opinion anyway, the radio exchanges between the Lusitania and the Admiralty between the 5th and the 7th of May, so when the Lusitania was 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic and to the time it sank, are still classified to this day. They have not been released. Now we come to something here that is quite interesting. It's a geographical, political, military reality. Great Britain, or the British Isles being geographically islands, have never been invaded since 1066. That's nearly 1,000 years. No records have been destroyed, and believe me, speaking as a Briton, I know this. One thing the British do very well is keep records. They love paper. They love paper. Now they love these things. So perhaps I'm not typically British because I don't like either. Nevertheless, all records dating back even to Saxon times, so we're going back to the 600s and 700s after Christ. All records are in the Public Records Office at Kew. It's nuclear proof. There is the part that one can study as a historian or researcher. Any Commonwealth citizen can get a reader's ticket. Any other foreign national can now do the same. And you can literally, it's a magnificent place, just to digress for one moment, because if we can imagine, you know these puzzles you probably had as a child, jigsaw puzzles, where you have to fit the shapes in until you get the whole picture. A lot of European countries, a lot of countries around the world have big holes in their history. They're puzzled. Armies have marched north, south, east, west, burned records, destroyed, and then it's the turn of the other nation. They come back and burn it. You see it in the Napoleonic Wars, you've seen it in the 7 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. But of course for Britain that hadn't happened. And so a lot of these pieces a lot of these records are dealing with the records of the English and eventually the British state in relation to all these other countries. So the pieces don't fit exactly, but they fill in some of the holes in many countries' history. All of these records, including anything to do with the now the First World War, Second World War, the Iraq War, they're all there. But the question is, can you get hold of them? When it was clear after the Battle of Britain that Hitler would not defeat Britain, all the records that had been taken out of London into specially prepared locations in the mountains in Wales and in Scotland were brought back into newly prepared bomb-proof shelters deep underneath certain areas or central areas of London. Nothing has been destroyed. Now, the common phrase for "we don't want you to know what's going on" is, "it is not in the public interest." It is not in the public interest. It was on the news last week, so this is something that really is very effective. Because unlike a lot of nations, it's not about, "this didn't happen, we deny this." It's simply silence. We know that you know something, but we're not going to say anything, so what are you going to do about it? It's very, very effective. And when things are not in the public interest, I'll show you something that's not in the public interest. You may or may not remember these two individuals, so this brings this from 1915 to the beginnings of the Iraq War in the early 2000s. This man on the left, Dr. David Kelly, was the world's greatest expert in chemical weapons. He was commissioned by Tony Blair's government to go to Iraq before the war started, of course, and establish whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. In other words, weapons that were not considered usable in a normal conventional war. Initially, this man thought, well, he probably has. But because he was a man of great integrity, when he did extensively spend a lot of time in Iraq, extensively researching this, he had come back and said, they don't have them. And of course, the British were going to war on a legal premise. It would only be legally possible to go to war if it could be proven that these weapons of mass destruction, and also the possibility of a nuclear capability, even if it hadn't been developed, could be proven. But then, of course, it's far too far down the line to say, we got that wrong, because the Americans are obviously pressuring the British to say, well, look, we need to get in there. We don't need you, but we do need you in a certain way. So Kelly was disgraced. He did resign. And then, of course, in I think it was July 2003, he committed suicide. Now, here it gets more interesting. Of course, the media tells you to commit suicide, and we can never really prove. Probably somebody does know. He either did or he didn't. But for most of us, we will probably never know. But what did happen to poor David Kelly was, at the post-mortem, which said that he slashed his wrists and he had taken quite a large amount of heavy drug that would have, combining with the loss of blood, sent him to sleep, would have lost consciousness and bled to death. But if he was killed and didn't commit suicide, then the evidence suggests, and I'm only going to say suggests, that he was murdered, because 5 separate pathologists said that he did not have sufficient chemical in him to induce death, and there was not sufficient loss of blood at the scene for him to have bled to death. The 2 paramedics who arrived, and I've actually got their names here somewhere, if we can find them. Not that you really probably need to know, but nevertheless, these paramedics, they're ordinary working people who had the courage to actually come out and say this, at great risk themselves. David Bartlett and Vanessa Hunt. These paramedics both said, in their experience of suicide, by the ulnar artery being slashed, there was nowhere near sufficient loss of blood at the site or from his body to suggest that he committed suicide. Also, and this has come out more recently, and it shows you how powerful propaganda is and how powerful the public's desire to say, oh, well, it's all history, it doesn't matter, can't do anything about it. The bottle of water he needed to drink in order to swallow the tablets had no fingerprints on the bottle. His glasses, which he wore, had no fingerprints. The knife with which he cut his wrist, which was at the scene, had no fingerprints. And there were no fingerprints on the tablets that he'd pushed out of the plastic sheet. Now, if I was in MI6 or MI5, I'd regard that as a complete, as we say in England, cock-up, a complete failure. You've got to do better than that. So, nevertheless, now I do not say that this is fundamentally, absolutely a case of suicide, but it certainly points to something a little bit more difficult. Then we come to the man on the right, who actually, he does have a very nice smile, because actually his smile reflects what the sort of man he was. He was very popular on both sides of the House of Commons, both amongst the Conservatives and the Labour. He was the Labour Minister, Foreign Secretary. He resigned from Tony Blair's government because he could not accept the reason for going to war. It was not valid, and the quote was, "This war is immoral, untenable, unwinnable. We are about to destabilise an area, the consequences of which we cannot even begin to imagine." Now, poor Robin Cook, I get quite emotional about this because I met this man. He's a very, very good man. And he died, apparently, in 2005, in August, on a walking trip with his wife in Scotland. Now, it happened to be where he was walking in Scotland, two other walkers were able to resuscitate him. It was supposed to be a massive heart attack, according to how the post-mortem was declared. Helicopter arrives, in goes, they revive him, in goes Robin Cook. His wife is not allowed to go in the helicopter, and I don't know how it is in Holland or Germany or France or anywhere else, but a relative usually always is allowed to accompany the person, because psychologically, if they're conscious, it's very, very important. It's also psychologically important for the relative. She was left on the mountainside, and nobody denies that, and the two walkers escorted her down. He's dead by the time he gets to the hospital. Now, there's a lot of medical equipment on that helicopter. If the two men that revived him managed to do it with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and massage, I'm not saying it is totally the case, but it's more than likely they might have kept him alive with all the medical equipment available on the helicopter. The post-mortem report is not any longer there for public view. But the thing is, just like the second supplementary manifest for the arms on board the Lusitania, there's another post-mortem report. So we don't even have the original, possibly falsified one, and we certainly don't have access to the post-mortem report of what perhaps really did happen. And I have to say perhaps, because I'm not in a position to prove this, perhaps we never will be, I don't know. But the point is you have scapegoats in history when the needs of the state, and it can be any state, I'm sure it happens in every state on earth, even the places that we think, as we say in English, are squeaky clean, like Sweden and Norway, every state on earth has a responsibility, let's look at it like this, a responsibility to ensure the stability of its political and economic and social system. So we are all expendable, of course. Everybody is expendable. And these two men, and the men we mentioned from 100 years ago, certainly were. Now the question is, today we are here because of the deaths of, well, not only the 1,206 people, but the 1,956 people that were on the Titanic, all their relatives, all those people who knew nothing about what really happened. Because we're looking at something that is very, very much a reality of today, and that is to ensure that what we're told about is not even half the story. There are many other instances. We can look at 9/11, we can look at MH17, we can look at how we demonise and prepare other countries and prepare them for war. I'll give you an example. Have you noticed how we prepared ourselves for war with Iraq? Not the first Gulf War, the second. How we prepared ourselves to stabilise the area by going into Afghanistan. How we prepared ourselves and are preparing ourselves for war against Iran, possibly. The problem is with this at the moment is there seems to be a stalling in the political intent, and how long that will last, I don't know. And we're doing something, particularly as Europeans, I think, which is very, very dangerous indeed. And I think, although we all have free will, the one thing we have in Europe, and I'm going to stick my neck out here, so forgive me if there's anybody from North America or Australasia or Africa, Europe is the most advanced continent on earth, politically, socially, religiously, economically, perhaps not the most profitable, but economically. It has achieved things that no other continent has achieved. And it's been founded upon hundreds, possibly over 2,000 years of metamorphosis of race, of ethnicity, of social structures into what we have today. And I'm not talking about just the European Union, I'm talking about the whole 50 nations in Europe. Don't forget there are only 28 nations in the EU. And it's founded upon the fact that really the concept of honesty and truth is the best possible guarantor for a healthy society. And we know there's probably less truth evident than there are lies, but nevertheless, our society has been founded upon that. In June this year, we don't only look at June the 18th this year, the close of the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic legacy. We look at the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. The first covenant, for want of a better word, between, in those days, the head of state, in those days the other arm of society, which was very powerful then, the church, and the ordinary people. Not, of course, the poor people, but the people that represented them to some degree, which were the military side, the barons, the landowners. But what that is, it's a recognition that all aspects of society, every part of society, really needs to find a consensus if it's to move forward and become and remain healthy. Now, this is where I'm being contentious here, and I'm very open to anybody saying, I don't agree. Now, please do so if you don't when I finish. We are now doing to Russia what we have done to Germany for 100 years and what we did to France in the 18th century, not the 19th century. We are demonising a people for the acts of their government, not recognising, or the British public, the European public generally, and possibly the world public, not recognising that there is a much deeper question here. I'm certainly not condoning the actions of President Putin or the Russian government, but what I'm trying to say is, if we stand outside ourselves, even if we have a personal conflict with someone, it's very hard to stand outside yourself and think, how am I being perceived? How am I being perceived? No matter how I think I'm being perceived, how is the other person with whom I have a conflict perceive me? Can I put myself in their position? It's an immensely difficult spiritual sort of moral struggle, but it can be done. And what I'm going to suggest is just along the road there, in NATO European HQ, there is something that most people haven't really bothered to not check, but comprehend the significance of. From the Russian point of view, they have seen a reverse iron curtain closing round Russia. I'm now looking at it from the Russian point of view. It's not necessarily what I agree with, but isn't it? One by one, they have seen every one of the countries that they controlled as satellite states co-opted and drawn into NATO. Now, NATO ostensibly, after the Cold War, needs probably, by the raison d'etre of its existence, either potential or actual enemies, or potential or actual threats. And by the closing of this reverse iron curtain, from the Russian point of view, they're seeing, if we're supposed to be no longer in a Cold War, if we're supposed to be a nation embraced within the world economic and political system, even though we have different ideas, why do we feel ourselves enclosed? Because in the early 1960s, when we tried to place nuclear weapons in the Caribbean, you threatened us with nuclear war. Is it not legitimate and reasonable, at least, to say, oh, hold on a minute, you now want to push NATO's borders 700 miles across the Ukraine, and your increase in arms expenditure and the presence of arms in the Baltic states, in Poland, and right up to the Russian borders, we see as a hostile move, and we want to know why. From the Western point of view, we're saying, look, you not only invaded Georgia, but Georgia was being co-opted into NATO. Now, the thing is that it's what's called backyard policy. There is a backyard, so to speak, that we generally agree, if this is my backyard, you don't step into it, and I respect your backyard. Georgia is definitely Russia's backyard. It's not good for the Georgians necessarily, but it's a realpolitik. The Ukraine is seen as their backyard. But we're saying, look, you've annexed part of the Ukraine, an independent sovereign state. You're now attempting to annex by proxy, almost openly now, part of the eastern Ukraine. But if we try, and I think it's our moral responsibility to not support what Putin does, because I certainly don't, but we try, what are they thinking here? What are they trying to do? The Eastern Slavic mentality, and now these are difficult concepts to deal with, but I want to introduce them. The Russian mentality is Greater Russia. Now, the extreme eastern part of the Ukraine has an ethnically very high percentage, in fact, majority ethnic percentage of Russians. The Crimea certainly does. And we've almost accepted that, because when the Crimea was annexed, and we all made a great fuss about this, quite legitimately in many respects, it's blown over very quickly. We almost accepted it. In fact, so have most of the Ukrainians. Now the problem is that it's much more difficult to possibly annex or isolate parts of the eastern Ukraine. However, I have very good Russian friends and very good Ukrainian friends. And one of my Ukrainian friends, his wife, is a colonel in the Ukrainian army, permanently stationed with a cadre of Ukrainian military personnel at NATO HQ. Now, I'm not going to say any more than that. And the Russians know that, of course, they're not stupid. And they feel threatened, just as arguably our media tells us that we're threatened. But the deeper issue is this. What we are doing to Russia is actually, even from the strategic point of view, very unintelligent. And you have to ask, why are we doing this? Imagine a situation where, from the coast of Portugal to the Ural Mountains, let's just use that as the European geographical and geographical barrier, we have the potential to build a remarkably cohesive society. We have unlimited energy in Russia, which is infrastructure poor and energy rich, whereas Europe is very much the other way around. We have a European culture. Beyond any shadow of a doubt, Russia is a European culture, even though it may seem rather strange to us in the extreme western of Europe. But what we have, of course, is a policy that the British have been undertaking since the 1850s in the Crimean War, a deliberate isolation of Russia. And now, of course, we're seeing this with America, because look at it from the Americans' point of view, very, very practical. The Americans are feeling we are in economic decline. We are possibly not, well, certainly not at the moment in military decline. But the problem we have is that we're faced with the rising of Asia and the possibility of a very powerful, very strong Europe. So what do we need to do here? It's probably very expedient for us to ensure that Europe is not united. If we can drive a wedge between west, centre and east. Now, they've driven a wedge between west and centre for a long time, but now that we've just got west and east now, preventing Russia being part of any future of Europe is probably the most short-sighted, despite what they're doing, the most short-sighted and tragic policy that any government, including the EU collectively, can possibly undertake. All we can do as individuals, now you may not agree with me, which I perfectly well accept, is that we have the heritage of a society that can question. You might not be able to change anything. And one of my Russian friends said, in your country, and in the West generally, you can say whatever you like, write whatever you like, publish whatever you like. In my country, we can't say what we want, we can't write what we want and publish what we want, but the result is the same, nothing changes. And he's got a point. The problem is with Russia is that if one understands where they are going back to, in the 3 great world wars we've had, that the Russians see their sacrifice as phenomenal, and it is. They've sacrificed more than every other country combined in terms of personnel, in terms of the destruction of their infrastructure and their economy, with the exception of Germany in the Second World War. And they now regard themselves as threatened again. But the Russian nature is to resist things and just simply say, fine, if that's the way you want it. They are not going to change. What we can do is say, we don't support what you're doing, but let's have an open hand instead of a clenched fist. And there would be, I suggest, and this is only my opinion, but I suggest we need to look at that as Europeans, independently of the United States of America. Now, this is rather convoluted, what I've said, but I've tried to bring you through a problem we still have today, which is propaganda and the blinding of people to understanding what's going on. So please, throw anything you want at me. If I don't know the answer, I'll say, I'm sorry, I don't know, because I'm not a politician. I won't give you rubbish.